In the last 6 weeks of his life must have been business. Who was he meeting? Local law enforcement officials indicated to us that they too would like to know that answer. And that's when our search led us to begin looking into this man, flight school owner Rudy Deckers, responsible 2 years ago for an influx of literally hundreds of Arab pilot trainees. This then is the central dramatic question to our story, to the tragedy of September 11th. Did Arab men just wander up and down the Gulf Coast of Florida as easily as if they'd been listening to Tom Petty albums all their lives? Or were they assisted by a global network? If they were, Rudy Deckers would be the place to look. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Deckers was everywhere on television, portraying himself as just an innocent businessman, victimized by the perpetrators of one of history's greatest crimes. Is he? The first thing we heard about Rudy Deckers came from a female researcher who called to tell us he sounded phony to her in his television appearances, that there was something odd about him. Was it female intuition? He sounded sincere enough to us.
This morning at 7 o'clock I heard what happened, and the first thing I questioned myself was if I would have known. I would kill him by my own bare hands. If I have a Muslim coming in right now, I think that I'm going to be a human being and tell him, get the hell out of my property here. The day that all this occurred, we felt very, very sad, like all the other Americans.
Deckers isn't American, he's Dutch. And his response to pass the buck on to unnamed underlings sounds a little rehearsed.
How was it that you first came in contact with these men?
I have heard yesterday from my own police, because I don't have contact with every student that walks in, that these two individuals came in July in 2000, checked our facility, said that they were flying in another facility in Tampa. They were not happy at that facility. They came back after a couple of days and decided that they wanted to fly with us.
That seems a simple, straightforward chronology. But compare it with the words of the chief flight instructor at Jones Aviation in nearby Sarasota, Florida, who tells another story altogether.
It was on or about June of, would have been 2000. They came up from Huffman Aviation. It's not our policy normally to enroll students from other schools. It has to pretty much be an exception. And in their case, I did make an exception for the reasons they gave me.
Deckers said terrorist ringleader Atta was already an experienced pilot when he arrived at Huffman Aviation.
So were they learning to fly from square one, essentially?
No, Mr. Atta had a private pilot license already, and I see he, if I pronounce right, he had only a few hours. They did a private pilot license with us, single-engine commercial and multi-engine commercial.
But we soon heard this statement totally contradicted. More anomalous evidence.
Atta was already a pilot. He already had a private pilot's license. Isn't that right?
Not when he came here. No. He was close to getting a private license. He had 3/4 of the course complete.
The same course that Marwan was taking.
Yeah.
But but there was no discernible difference in training skills and skills events between the two?
Between the two, Atta was the better pilot of the two, but both of them, I mean, looking at them both as two students learning together, where they were in the curriculum when they came here, they should have been a lot further along.
The FBI, we learned, had known about terrorist training at Rudy Deckers Flight School for some time, which probably accounts for their swift response.
The FBI visited you just a few hours ago and confiscated some records. Can you tell us about that?
It was yesterday, 2:30 a.m. They called my managers here in Venice and wanted to see 2 files. I came in at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were still there. I talked briefly with them. They were ready to go. I told them that we have more customers, clients from the Middle East, and I thought it was a good idea to give them all my files. So I gave him a couple of 100 files from the last years.
The contents of the files of Rudy Deckers Flight School might answer some persistent questions about the terrorist conspiracy's operations in Florida, and even reveal what kind of help they may have received in this country and from whom. But these questions haven't been answered because the FBI hasn't talked about what's in them. One Venice law enforcement official told us they, the FBI, loaded 2 Ryder trucks right outside the police station, then drove the trucks right onto a C-130 military cargo plane at Sarasota Airport, which flew out with Jeb Bush aboard. Since the FBI is not talking, maybe somebody should ask Jeb Bush. Then the cat got out of the bag just a little bit. as it sometimes does in the immediate aftermath of a major event.
Let me ask you this. One of these men is widely considered to be responsible for a bus bombing in Israel. How was it that they could gain admittance to your school?
Well, they didn't came through our paperwork like they're calling from Europe, and we know 2 months ahead that they're showing up. As I said, they came from another flight school out of Florida. Probably that flight school did all the INS paperwork with them in their country.
Authorities immediately denied that the Mohammed Atta, who masterminded the demolition of the World Trade Center, was the same Mohammed Atta who had 15 years earlier blown up an Israeli bus. So there apparently were two separate Arab terrorists with the exact same name. But then we discovered a story from September 15th's Washington Post stating Mohammed Atta had been to International Officer School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, and that others of the terrorists had attended the Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas and the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California.
Hello to my subscribers. That was a snippet of Daniel Hopsicker's Mohammed Atta and the 9/11 cover-up in Florida. This documentary that was released in 2003, that's about a little bit over an hour, that covers the Hamburg Cell's activities in Florida, specifically the city Venice. Hamburg Cell specifically being Marwan al-Shayhi, Mohammed Atta, and Ziad Jarrah, and somebody who couldn't join named Ramzi bin al-Shib. Today I will be covering my newest form of videos, which will be a separate video series from my current video series that will be reading the book that Daniel Hopsicker made about this documentary, or that is included with this documentary. I would say it's just a longer form version of the documentary, gets into more detail. One thing I wanted to cover prior to that is a recent news article that I wasn't aware of Rudy Deckers, that occurred recently this year, actually, about two months ago. So let me pull it up. All right. So, former Florida man who unknowingly trained 9/11 terrorists dies of heart failure. April 17th, 2024. A former Florida resident who unknowingly trained 9/11 terrorists has died in the Philippines from heart failure. He was 67. Rudy Deckers, who was born in the Netherlands, died last week in the Philippines of heart failure, according to a press release sent to Wink News. Wink News is a South Florida television show. This is their website where they post different articles. The filmmakers of a documentary on the 20th anniversary of the attacks provided the release. According to the filmmakers of the documentary he was featured in, Deckers had been struggling with his health for years. For those of us old enough to remember the icy stare of Mohammed Atta was the first face tied to the 9/11 attacks. Amy Osher was a reporter who got that photo, and another of his accomplices, Marwan al-Shayhi, after Deckers, the Venice flight school owner where they were trained, slipped their driver's licenses to her. Osher and her photographer surprised Decker while government agents were at Huffman Aviation seizing documents days after 9/11. Decker wanted to tell his story, how he inadvertently taught two of the terrorists to fly planes. Over the years, his willingness to speak made him a thorn in the government's side. He testified in front of Congress, wrote a book, and was featured in a documentary on the 20th anniversary of the attacks. Deckers went on to get in trouble for trafficking drugs and spent time in a Texas prison before being released and deported. He desired to come back to the U.S., but never did. So I thought that was an interesting little snippet of something that just happened recently. Rudy Deckers is officially dead. So that was kind of just something that, some passing information that I know isn't relevant to 9/11, but something that was interesting because I wanted to start this series, and Rudy Deckers is such a vital figure to the group's interactions in Venice, Florida. So let's get into the book. So the book is titled, let me see, Mohammed Atta and the Venice Flying Circus, or Welcome to Terrorland, Mohammed Atta and the 9/11 Cover-Up in Florida. I got a digitized version of this book from a website, documentpub.com. I can post the link in my video description. Let's start off with the first chapter. So the first chapter is Welcome to Venice. This is the story of Mohammed Atta, a black-hearted psychopath in Florida, a pirate's paradise. If either had been different, September 11th might never have happened. We started with two simple questions. Why Atta? Why Florida? Except to point out his cold stare and unfriendly manner. Little attention has been paid to the personality of Mohammed Atta, the man authorities quickly dubbed the terrorist ringleader. J-Lo and Ben received more in-depth coverage in a week than a man who engineered the murder of 3,000 people. Based on the accounts of eyewitnesses to Atta's actions in Florida, we discovered that Atta exhibited behavior that only can be described as psychotic. In fact, far from deserving the heroic mantle placed on his shoulders by Arab radicals, self-respecting Islamic fundamentalists should be ashamed that he sprang from their number. Mohammed Atta wasn't a hero. He was a psychopath. Before illustrating why Atta richly deserves that label, we want to first take a look at the Florida as a pirate's paradise part of our equation. What attractions were there in the Sunshine State that made it the Hamburg's cadre overwhelming choice for home away from home? Something has been struggling to emerge into our national consciousness concerning the physical location of most of the terrorist conspiracy activities in the U.S. Mohammed Atta and his inner circle were in Florida while pursuing their murderous designs. The plot was masterminded from Florida. What to make of this choice? Although media attention kept pointing away from the state, to Phoenix, San Diego, and Minneapolis, 14 of the 19 hijackers voted with their feet and hung their terrorist shingle out in a state which has been governed since 1999. Must be said by the current president's brother. That's talking about Jeb Bush, by the way. With an entire continent seemingly at their disposal, the terrorists chose Florida to be their American beachhead and then base. Why did Mohammed Atta, a man described by many who met him as a really natty dresser, lead his cadre from a bustling European metropolis with his internationally famous red light district to a retirement community in a place where the only action involves senior citizens lining up for an early bird special? It's an odd choice. It's not as if Florida reminded young Arab men from desert kingdoms of the trackless wastes back home. The state that made Don Johnson, Elian Gonzalez, and Pink Flamingos famous is as far from being a desert kingdom as it gets. There's the weather for one. While a mecca for northeasterns during winter, Florida in early July, when the FBI says Atta arrived in Venice, is a steamy place. Even the natives head north until it cools off. Florida, wrote one early Spanish explorer, is full of bogs and poisonous fruits, barren, and the very worst country that is warmed by the sun. Some people will tell you not much has changed. Yet 14 of the 19 hijackers based themselves in the Sunshine State. And since 15 of the 19 terrorist hijackers were Saudi, the story of the terrorist conspiracy is perforce a story about Saudis in Florida. The conspiracy which took down the World Trade Center is a story about young Arab men practicing touch and goes at obscure Florida airports like this one in Venice, and checking in and out of hotels in Florida destination resorts like Orlando. In the weeks after September 11th, the nation began to ask questions of Florida. Television commentators spoke of a Florida curse. In truth, strange news had been emanating from that steamy world for some time. The connection between Florida and most of the hijackers and the deadly attacks had been leading questioners whether the Sunshine States had become a haven for international terrorists, where the world's nefarious characters feel free to congregate in modern-day Casablanca. First, we couldn't count the votes. Now, we're hosting terrorists, said one state lawmaker. My God, Florida is always involved in these things, said Oscar Westerfield, a retired FBI official who specialized in foreign counterintelligence and is now a security consultant in Tampa, Florida. Florida Governor Jeb Bush disagreed. After the attack, Governor Bush defended the flight schools as victims of fanatics. After moving to Venice, we received a missive a missive from someone who minced no words in his explanation for the attractions of Florida to the terrorists. You reside in a druggy, mobbed-up state that also houses a lot of foreign unfriendlies with ties to various international bad guys, is run by a bush, and where people become alligator bait and get lost in the swamps quite frequently, wrote our friend. Additionally, there seems to be a major overload of paramilitary types floating in. If you think that sounds extreme, listen to what one of the state's own senators had to say. Florida has long been a lair of spies and now of terrorists, said U.S. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, in the September 14, 2001 Orlando Sentinel-Tribune. Graham said, Florida itself is a significant crossroads of international intrigue and clandestine collection. What Graham is referring to is explained in a conversation between two layers outside the federal courthouse in Miami, one local and one from Washington. You know, the most wonderful thing about Miami is its location, said the local lawyer. What do you mean? The visitor asked. It's so close to the United States. So, while Mohammed Atta and Florida are a surrealistic pair, they also make a certain sense together. He always drove a Pontiac Grand Am in a rainbow of colors. Atta was an Arab Don Johnson, starring in his own Miami Vice. And he looked and sounded, said eyewitness Brad Warwick of Pompano Beach, who rented several cars to Atta, as if he had been in the country for a long time. Atta and his cadre of terrorists lived in Florida, drank in Florida, and stuffed $20 bills down strippers' G-strings in skin joints all up and down the state. And they learned to fly in Florida, too, mostly in the tiny town of Venice. It made nary a ripple when news first surfaced, though only briefly, that 3 of the 4 terrorist pilots learned to fly in a retirement community on Florida's Gulf Coast. Mohammed Atta and sidekick and bodyguard Marwan al-Shehi were the ones identified as having been flight students here. Then it was reported, in a strangely muted tone for what was big news, that others of the terrorists had been to Venice as well, including Ziad Jarrah, said to have been at the controls of the plane that went down in western Pennsylvania. 3 of the 4 9/11 pilots learned to fly at 2 flight schools at the tiny Venice airport. A terrorist trifecta out at the Venice airport. Venice, Florida, is the biggest 9/11 crime scene that wasn't reduced to rubble. But it hasn't been treated that way, and no one has offered any reason why. Both flight schools were owned by Dutch nationals. Both had been recently purchased at about the same time. A year later, terrorists began to arrive, in numbers greater than we have so far been told. All of this must be just a freak coincidence, according to the FBI. We call it their magic Dutch boy theory. How had the FBI known the exact identities of the hijackers less than 24 hours after the attack? If their files had been so readily in hand, why hadn't they apprehended them before they killed thousands? And when conscientious FBI agents did try to raise alarms about known al-Qaeda sympathizers at U.S. flight schools, why were they ignored? The only answers ever given by the FBI to why the terrorists came to the U.S. to learn to fly was because flight training is cheaper in the U.S. But Atta and Marwan ended up paying more than double what flight training costs elsewhere, according to aviation experts. So price was apparently not the object. And besides, in Florida alone, there are over 200 flight schools. What inducements led them to the 2 in Venice? Flight school owner Rudy Deckers inadvertently released paperwork showing that Atta and sidekick Marwan al-Shehi paid $28,000 each for what the chief flight instructor at a nearby flight school, Tom Hammersley of Jones Aviation, explained to us was available at his school, as well as dozens of others, for a fraction of the price. Were the inflated prices Atta and his minions paid some kind of terrorist surcharge? As days and then weeks passed with no words as to why many terrorists had been in Venice, we grew increasingly suspicious. The ugly truth was that there had been no official explanation for why the terrorists beat a path from the Baltic Sea to Florida's Gulf Coast. Was it that no one knew, or was it that they did? Venice, Florida is an unlikely center of intrigue, but the Venice airport, set beside an unsuspecting population of golf-playing retirees, is another story. We discovered it has a history as a freebooting port of call for an international cast of Learjets setting rogues, spies, villains, and terrorists. Most of the key terrorists had Venice connections. Hamburg cadre member Ramzi bin al-Shib, a candidate for the 20th hijacker, was on his way to Venice until he was denied a visa. Ramzi's replacement as the so-called 20th hijacker, Zacharias Moussaoui, we discovered had also been in Venice, with Arnie Krutoff, one of the 2 Dutch National Flight School owners. Krutov told a local aviation executive he had been grilled for 2 days at the Sarasota courthouse about his connections to Moussaoui by an assistant attorney general from the Justice Department accompanied by top-level officials from FBI, in town taking depositions from potential witnesses in Moussaoui's upcoming trial. Even if it stopped right there, wouldn't it seem Venice would be fertile soil for investigative journalists looking for behind-the-scenes reports about the terrorist conspiracy's activities? Yet, when we rolled into town 2 months after the attack, we did not find ourselves rubbing elbows with the Mike Wallace or Bob Woodward at Clark's restaurant downtown, and we weren't tripping over clusters of hard-drinking journalists at the bar of the Crow's Nest on the Gulf. In fact, there were no investigative reporters nosing around in Venice. Speculation about why the terrorists found a tiny retirement community on Florida's Gulf Coast so congenial to their plans has not been voiced in the major media. We find this more than passing strange. But then, we knew quite a bit about Venice before we got there, since our parents had a winter house there since retiring almost 25 years ago. The family gets together there almost yearly for a few days of quality family time in the balmy Gulf breezes. Because of this personal history, we began to doubt official explanations or lack of the same. Venice is on Florida's sleepy Gulf Coast, sandwiched among the better-heeled resorts of Naples, Sanibel Island, Boca Grande, a Bush family favorite, and Sarasota, home to Katherine Harris. Popular pastimes included shuffleboard, golf, and leafing through magazines in doctors' waiting rooms. Restaurant traffic peaks at 6 p.m. Crosswalks allow extra time to get across the street, and have that beep failure in case you can't see. The town's claim to fame, till now, was that every year Venice hosts a shark tooth and seafood festival, said to be a unique event showcasing the shark tooth capital of the world. When it comes to shark teeth, all that can be said is that they don't get many people really excited. The G-Gosh shops lining Venice's main drag set tourists in with the shark's teeth and move them on to something else. Those few who go wild for shark's teeth suffer, we think, from a paucity of imagination and have altogether too much time on their hands. Venice's real distinction is that it is the second oldest population in the entire United States. The median age is 69. Local advertising skews towards wheelchairs, home health care, funeral directors, specialist physicians, and estate planning. Commercials for the Clapper play in heavy rotation. So by billing itself as the shark tooth capital of the world, the city fathers may just be putting their best foot forward, because there's no cachet in being known as the assisted living capital of the world. Despite the elderly population, one thing felt familiar to Atta when he got to Venice, oddly enough. When he was a student at Technical University in Hamburg studying supposedly urban architecture and planning, he hung out at a place called Sharky's Billiard Bar. After moving to Venice, he hung out at a restaurant and bar just across from the Venice airport, also called Sharky's Small World. Although Deckers testified he hadn't seen Atta in many months, Atta was seen at the Venice Sharky's just 2 weeks before 9/11 meeting with the flight school owner. Struck in the sweltering middle of nowhere, 30 miles of mangrove swamps from the nearest real town, a retirement community of overwhelmingly white people does not appear to have much to offer to healthy 30-something men, even if they were terrorists. And it doesn't seem like an ideal place to hide an operation comprising several dozen dark-skinned foreign nationals. So why did young men choose to spend their final years on the planet in a town where handicapped parking spaces at the supermarket fill up fast? Why would healthy young men gravitate toward a retirement community anywhere? Because it ain't Hamburg. There's no red light district, unless you count the traffic signal downtown. One possible answer is that a bivouacking in Venice was someone else's decision. But of course, if Mohammed Atta and his Hamburg cadre didn't just wander in Rudy Decker's flight school door, we have an entirely different story than our government has so far been telling. When we rolled into Venice 2 months after 9/11, the town was quiet. On the surface, but jittery underneath. A discovery made after being pulled over by the local Venice police twice on our first day in town. In 25 years of visiting the parents, we don't remember ever seeing a cop. The Venice airport was under around-the-clock 24/7 surveillance. A police cruiser roved the perimeter. Although this stretched the resources of a small department, there seemed no reasonable explanation for it. Were local officials expecting the terrorists to make a vengeful return appearance? Most likely, the terrorists would be sending postcards saying, "Thanks for the help. Wish you were here." It made no sense. Later on, we learned that all three of the top city officials filed for concealed weapons permits at about the same time. It still didn't make sense, but now it seemed more serious. On each of the 2 occasions we were pulled over, we identified ourselves, as a visiting journalist, and since neither stop resulted in a ticket, but just a friendly wave, we concluded that they were some kind of local law enforcement custom, a meet and greet. On the second occasion, we asked the officer it would be prudent to pay a courtesy call to the police chief. He allowed that it might. So we did, stopping at the new police headquarters to say hello. And we were glad we did, because the sergeant on duty proved congenial, which gave us a chance to ask a few questions about Rudy Deckers, the owner of Huffman Aviation, who had been everywhere on television during the days after the attack. It was a simple question, really. We wanted to know if Deckers had any local priors. But it made Sergeant Marty Traynor sigh. Then he started to say something, though thought better of it, and sighed again. He said he couldn't tell us if Deckers had been in any trouble in Venice, because all of his files were gone. Gone? The FBI took all of our files. Everything. They loaded the files right outside this window, said Traynor, indicating a parking lot outside the station, into 2 Ryder trucks, then drove them right onto a C-130 military cargo plane at the Sarasota airport, which took off for Washington with Jeb Bush aboard. We will come back to visit the question of the governor of Florida's national security responsibilities. The important point was what was taking files was a lot different than copying them. The FBI wasn't taking any chances. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Venice city manager George Hunt said to reporters, "It's really just a coincidence that terrorists chose such a place as Venice to be their training ground for the unspeakable." Was that true? Determining whether it was or not would be complicated by the fact that the FBI had dutifully confiscated anything that looked remotely like evidence. What the FBI was doing with it was still anybody's guess. Our suspicion that there was something wrong with the official story would grow steadily, but the first indication we had that they might be correct came in the first encounter with local law enforcement. The police spokesman seemed troubled that he lacked the ability to respond to questions about the possible criminal background of flight school owner Rudy Deckers. It sounded as if he would have liked to. He sounded none too happy about the fact that all police files pertinent to 9/11 were gone. At the time, we wrote it off as just stepped on toes, a little resentment by local law enforcement when they were brushed aside by federal agents. But maybe it was something more. After a week in Venice, we realized in some horror that the terrorists had been flying right over our parents' house several times, miles east of the airport. There were lots of flying at one time, too, apparently in virtual squadrons, according to the local Venice gondolier in a story written while Atta was at the Venice airport. The city council heard numerous complaints from residents, upset about student pilots taking off at Venice Municipal Airport and flying low right over their homes, as each circled the airport and practiced landings again and again, in a maneuver called touch and go. One local resident, Walter Fife, a clearly indignant fellow, told the council he had counted 90 student flights over a house in a 2-hour period. There were, he figured, about 15 planes flying overhead, 6 times each. 15 planes, a terror squadron, Bin Laden, air. When Fife's wife, Gerda, contacted Huffman Aviation, reported the gondolier, an employee there suggested that Fifes could move out if the noise bothered them. The city council took no action, not even to reprimand the Huffman employees for being rude to Walter Fife's wife, Gerda, although we bet they wouldn't like it if somebody was talking trash to their mom. Huffman Aviation had some juice in Venice. Unraveling the connection between the terrorists and the unlikely place to which they flocked became our major endeavor. It would take more than a year before any answers became clear. On the other hand, the answer to our second question, why Atta, came all at once after we had finally been successful in a month-long quest to track down Mohammed Atta's erstwhile American girlfriend, who wasn't eager to be found. We learned from her what it was about. Mohammed Atta that made him uniquely qualified to fly into a skyscraper without flinching. Our search for the terrorist ringleader girlfriend is fully covered later. For now, we'll just say that after a lengthy process of digging, we found the young woman named Amanda Keller, who local news accounts stated that had lived for a short time with Mohammed Atta. When she hooked up with Atta, Amanda Keller was a willowy 20-year-old lingerie model and stripper with spiky pink hair. She worked nights for an escort service called Fantasies in Lingerie, which catered to a mixed crowd of politicians, judges, high rollers, and socialites of both sexes, just down the street from Cheetah's, a strip club Atta was known to frequent in nearby Sarasota. Amanda was Mohammed Atta's live-in girlfriend in Venice for more than 2 months. And while the full story of her experience awaits a later chapter, one supremely horrific experience should be brought up now, because it clearly shows Atta to have been someone capable of driving a Boeing 767 airliner into tons of steel and glass. The two went out almost every night during their brief time together. Amanda told us, to clubs like Area 51 and Margarita Maggie's in Sarasota. They were, as she described it, part of a whole scene. When she went out, we would meet pilots from Africa, Germany, and there were always a lot of Arabs, she said. But the good times didn't last too long, and after 2 months, Amanda was ready to move on. But instead of cluing him in during a quiet dinner at a restaurant somewhere, she dumped him in a humiliatingly public fashion in a nightclub where they were partying with a bunch of Atta's friends. Amanda met a good-looking haired party animal who she noticed dancing bare-chested near her. We'll let her tell the story. We were at Margarita Maggie's in Sarasota near the quay, she began. Angelina, Olivia, Timothy, Jurgen, Sabrina, Mohammed, Wolfgang, they were all there. And Mohammed, like a dumbass, was standing on top of a speaker dancing. The man could not dance to save his life. He was real stiff, just kind of shaking, doing that old Roxbury head bob thing. You know, he embarrassed me instantly when we got there, and I pretended I didn't know him, Amanda said. I was dancing on stage because on stage the guys can't come up and dance with the girls. I was up there with a whole bunch of other girls and Angelina, and this cute guy was dancing right below us. And the light was hitting him, and he had this long, beautiful hair, and he looked at me and I got real embarrassed. The cute guy's name was Garrett, we heard. I had seen Angelina hug him earlier in the night, and I said to her, "You got to introduce me to him." Mohammed was just a few feet away watching, and I didn't give a damn, she said. And we finally started dancing, and he handed me his shirt, and Mohammed got really pissed. He, Garrett, wrapped up his shirt around my legs and was dirty dancing with me, and he slid me down off the stage and began brushing his lips against mine and kissed me, she said. Mohammed came over and tapped me on the shoulder, and I said, "What the hell do you want?" And he said, "What are you doing?" She said, mocking Atta's apparently British accented English. And I said, "I'm dancing." Garrett walked over to get himself a beer. And Mohammed said, "I'm leaving." And I said, "See ya." And he said, "When are you leaving?" And I said, "Whenever I feel like it." He asked me about Garrett, saying, "Who's that?" And I said, "I guess he's the new one." And I stayed until the club closed. That night, Amanda went home with her new beau. Things were never the same between her and Atta again. The day I stopped liking him, she mused aloud, was when I saw for him the first time out at the pool, wearing a lime green Speedo. He had a flanky ass. A lime green Speedo, when we thought about it, was one of those perfect details that makes sense instantly. It was a shock of recognition. That's exactly the kind of Euro-trash look someone like Atta would affect. Mohammed Atta in a lime green Speedo at the pool, revealing a flanky ass. There's nothing exceptional in this story, so far. Another half-sad, half-comical hookup gone wrong. But events now began to spin out of control. Although Atta's money paid the rent, the apartment's lease was in her name, Amanda explained. One night soon after meeting Garrett, the hot new guy, she brought him back to the apartment. She told Atta he could deal with it. He could move out, or he could check with the landlord. The hot new guy was sleeping over. The hot new guy was in the big bed. Atta was on the couch. After discussing what she would do with the apartment house manager, who corroborated her story, Amanda Keller unceremoniously dumped Atta's 3 suitcases and Gold's gym bag onto the parking lot underneath their second-floor apartment and called him a cab. "He told me he'd get even with me," he said. "You will be sorry for this." 1 week later, she found that he had met what he had met upon returning from a long night at the escort service to the apartment that was now hers alone. Amanda kept a pet dog and several cats as well, one of whom had just had a litter, she informed us haltingly. There were 6 adorable kittens, but when she opened the door to her apartment, she didn't hear any kitten noises, which was strange. And then she hit an overhead light, voice cracking with emotions. She told us what she saw. There were dead kittens. No pieces of dead kitten parts, strewn all over her living room. We asked her to repeat what she was saying, mainly because she couldn't believe what we were hearing. She walked through it again. "I came home from work, after breakfast, with Paige, a coworker, and then went down to the beach to talk for a while, so it was about 9 a.m. when I walked into my apartment," she said. She, the mother cat, had a litter of 6, and only 1 survived. The mother cat was dead, gutted on my kitchen table, and there were little baby cat parts all over the place. The only ones to survive were my little dog, that hid under the couch, and my Siamese, who sat on top of the fridge behind the cookie jar. There were dead kittens with their heads cut off, little body parts everywhere. I saw little baby legs and everything. It was awful. My friend Paige had to clean it up. I couldn't do it. In an apartment directly across the street from the Venice airport, an American girl who had spurned Mohammed Atta was stepping around kitten parts. She moved out the same day and never returned. Numerous descriptions of Atta have painted him as a menacing, dark, glaring, sometimes just wooden. We heard speculation from people who had been in presence in Venice that he looked as if he might have been brainwashed. Not that anyone in town had ever seen anyone who had been brainwashed, but he looked the way they thought somebody in that condition might look. But after listening to Amanda Keller's story, corroborated by eminently credible witnesses in coming pages, we are confident we got the answer to one of our biggest questions about 9/11 attack. Why Mohammed Atta had been the one chosen to commit one of history's most unspeakable crimes. It was because he could and he was capable of it. Not merely capable, but seemingly perfect for the job. Mohammed Atta was a psychopath, a kitten killer. We're in Jeffrey Dahmer territory here. While the FBI's phony chronology of Mohammed Atta will be explored later, it's worth noting that the events just described took place in Venice fully 4 months after the FBI says Atta left town. The FBI had said nothing at all about his numerous appearances in Venice after finishing flight training at Huffman in December of 2000. We don't know why. Perhaps if they admitted Atta had been in Venice, a lot more than they had told us, they would have to answer questions about what he was doing while he was there, and the authorities prefer not to see raised. Questions that might open up what legendary Southern Senator William Fulbright once called an endless can of worms. Fulbright was speaking about the Bay of Pigs invasion. But he might as well just have been describing the 9/11 cover-up in Florida. When we finally tracked her down, Amanda Keller displayed the reluctance to talk about her brush with history we soon discovered was common among people who had been contacted by the FBI after 9/11. Reporters had camped out on her doorstep in the days after the attack in a vain attempt to get her to talk. She told them that authorities had told her not to say anything, and then she disappeared, going into seclusion in a place where she had every right to think she would never be found, until she told us her story. After we finally managed to show up on her doorstep, she had spoken just 11 words to reporters, which sum up the way things were in Southwest Florida in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. "I can't really discuss anything," Amanda Keller told reporters. "I'm afraid I'll get in trouble."